The alert came in at 4:12 p.m. I remember the time because I was halfway through reviewing a subcontractor invoice, pencil resting against the margin, when my phone lit up beside the keyboard. It wasn't unusual to see a charge notification. What caught me wasn't the amount. It was the card. $214.17. Clean number. Nothing dramatic. But the last four digits didn't belong in circulation anymore. I knew that sequence the way you remember a lock combination you haven't used in years. It was Lindsay's old card, the one she said she closed. A year and a half ago, sitting across from me at the kitchen counter, she'd made a point of it, cutting it in half with a pair of scissors, sliding the pieces across the surface like proof. Said she didn't need it anymore. Said we should simplify things. I didn't open the transaction right away. I just stared at the notification. Merchant name first. Always the merchant name. I'd spent enough years managing budgets, tracking expenses, catching discrepancies before they became problems. You learn that patterns matter more than numbers. Numbers can lie by themselves. Patterns don't. The name on the charge wasn't random. It wasn't a gas station or a grocery store. It was specific, intentional, familiar. I felt something shift then, not sharp, not immediate. Just a quiet adjustment, like a level settling after being slightly off. I set the pencil down, opened the app, didn't scroll, didn't zoom in, just looked at the line long enough to understand one thing clearly. That card wasn't dead. And if it wasn't dead, then the conversation we had about it wasn't real. I locked my phone without digging further, sat back in the chair, and let the room go still around me. Outside, I could hear a truck backing up, the slow mechanical beep echoing through the site. Inside, everything felt measured, controlled. Because whatever this was, it wasn't a mistake. And I already knew. This wasn't going to be about $214. Up until that moment, nothing about our life stood out as broken. We lived in Austin, just outside the city where things still felt spaced out enough to breathe. The house wasn't extravagant, but it was solid. 2 stories, clean lines, a small backyard I kept level and trimmed on weekends. It was the kind of place you end up in after years of doing things the right way. No shortcuts, no risks. Lindsay worked part-time. Administrative work for a small firm downtown. Flexible hours, she said. Enough to stay busy. I covered the rest. Mortgage, utilities, insurance, groceries. Most of it ran through me without much discussion. Not out of control, just efficiency. That's how we operated. Quiet agreements instead of long conversations. Evenings were predictable. I'd get home first most days, set something up for dinner. Nothing complicated, grilled chicken, pasta, whatever made sense after a long day. She'd come in, drop her bag by the chair, and give me a quick kiss that felt more like routine than intention. We'd eat at the table, talk about small things. Her coworkers, something she saw online. Plans for the weekend that we rarely followed through on. It looked normal, and that was the part that made it easy not to question anything. When she started traveling more, it came with explanations that didn't feel worth examining. A friend in Portland she hadn't seen in years. A few days here and there. Cheap flights she didn't want to waste. She said it casually, like it had already been decided. I didn't ask for details. Not because I trusted everything without question, but because asking would have required shifting the balance we had settled into. And at the time, it didn't feel necessary. Same thing with the late nights. Some evenings she'd text around 6. Running a little late. Don't wait up for dinner. No urgency. No over-explaining. Just enough to close the loop. I'd eat alone, clean up, and leave a plate in the fridge out of habit more than expectation. Sometimes she'd touch it. Most times she wouldn't. When she got home, she moved quietly. Shower, phone in hand, then bed. Always with the screen turned slightly away. Not hidden, just angled enough to stay private. It didn't register as a problem then. It registered as distance. And distance, over time, becomes easy to live with. You adjust your routines around it. Fill in the gaps with work, small tasks, anything that keeps things moving forward without asking too many questions. That's where I was. Everything in place. Everything functioning. Nothing loud enough to force a closer look. Until that charge came through. $214.17. Not large enough to disrupt anything. Just enough to expose that something had been running quietly in the background for a long time. And I hadn't been paying attention. The next morning, I didn't bring it up. I left for work at the same time. Same routine. Coffee in a travel mug, keys on the counter, a short nod in her direction while she scrolled through something on her phone. Nothing in her expression suggested anything out of place. That mattered more than anything she could have said. By mid-morning, I had a quiet window between site visits. I sat in the truck, engine off, heat settling into the cab, and opened the account again. This time, I didn't stop at the notification. I pulled the full transaction history tied to that card. 1 month first. Nothing jumps out when you look at a single line. But when you stack them, same merchant categories, similar amounts, spaced in a rhythm, you start to see structure. Restaurants, not chains. Specific places. Hotels. Short stays. 1 night, sometimes 2. Retail charges that didn't match anything that ever came through the house. I went back another month. Then another. Each layer didn't introduce anything new. It just confirmed what the previous one suggested. The same types of charges repeating. Same cities. Same spacing between them. Patterns don't need explanation once they stabilize. They speak for themselves. I pulled up my calendar. Started lining up dates. Her trips to Portland. The late nights at work. The last-minute changes she used to mention without much detail. They weren't random anymore. They matched. Not perfectly, but close enough that the gaps didn't matter. I didn't feel anything sharp when it came together. No anger. No immediate reaction. Just a kind of stillness. Like standing in a room after something heavy has already fallen and settled. Because at that point, it wasn't about whether something had happened. It was about how long it had been happening. And how consistent it had been. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a single decision that went too far. It was structured, maintained, repeated without interruption. If you've made it this far, this story clearly caught your attention. If you're enjoying it, drop a like on the video. It helps me see what kind of stories you want more of next. Let's keep going. I zoomed in on one of the hotel charges. Recognized the area immediately. Not from anything she'd mentioned, but from my own work. I'd had meetings nearby months back. Client dinners. Walked those streets myself. Different purpose. Same location. I locked the phone and set it down on the seat beside me. There wasn't anything left to confirm. What I was looking at wasn't incomplete. It was finished. And the only thing that changed in that moment wasn't the situation. It was my position inside it. I wasn't guessing anymore. I was observing something that had already been built, quietly, deliberately, over time. And now that I could see the full structure, there was no reason to interrupt it. Not yet. I didn't confront her. That was the first decision I made after everything lined up. No questions. No testing reactions. No indirect comments to see if she'd slip. There wasn't any value in that anymore. Whatever version of the truth she would offer wouldn't match what I already had. So I left it alone. On the surface, nothing changed. I came home at the same time. Took off my boots by the door. Washed my hands at the sink while she stood a few feet away scrolling through her phone. The same quiet routine played out without interruption. That night, I cooked. Simple meal. Chicken, rice, something green on the side. Enough for 2, like always. She sat across from me, legs crossed, telling me about something minor that happened at work. A scheduling issue. Someone calling out sick. I nodded where it made sense. Asked a question once or twice to keep the rhythm intact. If she noticed anything different, she didn't show it. And that confirmed something important. She wasn't watching me closely. That kind of attention only exists when someone is unsure. When they're trying to manage both sides of something unstable. But she wasn't doing that. She was comfortable. That meant whatever this was, it had been in place long enough to feel normal to her. After dinner, I cleaned the kitchen while she moved to the couch. Same position she always took, angled slightly away, phone tilted just enough to keep the screen out of view without making it obvious. I didn't look. There was no reason to. I already understood the pattern. Later, in bed, she lay beside me, quiet, breathing steady. At some point, she shifted closer out of habit, her hand resting lightly against my arm like it had done for years. I didn't move, didn't respond. But I didn't pull away either. There's a point where something ends internally before anything changes externally. No announcement. No clear moment you can point to. Just a line that gets crossed without sound. That had already happened. I wasn't thinking about fixing anything anymore. That part had already been decided. What remained wasn't emotional. It was structural. Finances. Accounts. Ownership. Records. Things that existed outside of conversation. Things that didn't rely on explanations or interpretations. The next morning, I left a few minutes earlier than usual. Not to avoid her, just to create space. In the truck, before starting the engine, I sat for a moment and looked at the house through the windshield. Same as it had always been. Clean. Quiet. Nothing visibly out of place. From the outside, there was no indication that anything had shifted. And that was the part that made it clear. Whatever came next didn't require urgency. It required accuracy. Because once something like this becomes visible, the outcome isn't determined by reaction. It's determined by how well you understand what you're looking at. And I wasn't done looking yet. I didn't change my routine. That was intentional. Same hours. Same pace. Same small interactions that kept everything looking exactly the way it had before. If anything, I made sure I stayed consistent. No gaps. No signals. But I started paying attention. Not in a rushed way. Not like I was trying to catch something in the act. Just noticing what had always been there, now without filtering it out. The first thing was timing. Her messages followed a pattern I hadn't recognized before. Short updates. Always spaced in a way that closed conversation rather than invited it. Running late. Don't wait up. Busy tonight. No variation. No extra detail. Just enough to account for absence without opening space for follow-up. I stopped responding immediately. Not to test her, just to see if the delay changed anything. It didn't. There was no second message. No adjustment. No attempt to fill the silence. Which meant she wasn't measuring my reactions. She was maintaining her own schedule. At home, the details became clearer. The way she placed her phone face down more often now, but only in certain moments. The way she'd step into the other room to take a call, then come back with a neutral expression already in place. Not rehearsed. Just practiced. Her voice changed slightly when she talked about work. Not enough for anyone else to notice. But the pacing shifted. Certain names came up more often. Others disappeared completely. I didn't interrupt. I let her talk. And over time, the gaps between what she said and what I knew started to widen. Her trips followed the same structure. A few days' notice. Casual tone. No fixed return time until the last minute. And always tied to something that sounded reasonable enough not to question. I started marking the dates. Nothing formal. Just notes. Day, time, what she said, where she claimed she was going. Then I matched those to the transactions I had already seen. The overlap wasn't exact every time. But it didn't need to be. Patterns don't require perfection. They require consistency. And this was consistent. One night, she mentioned Portland again. Same friend. Same tone. I nodded like before. But this time, I already knew there had been 2 hotel charges in that city over the last 3 months, both during the same visits. She didn't hesitate when she spoke. That was the part that stood out. No pause. No adjustment. Just a clean delivery, like it had been said enough times to feel natural. I realized then that whatever version of the story she was telling, it wasn't something she was actively thinking about anymore. It had settled into routine. And routines don't break under pressure. They continue until something external interrupts them. I wasn't going to be that interruption. Not yet. Because the more I watched, the clearer everything became. Every small detail placed itself exactly where it belonged. No assumptions. No interpretation. Just observation. And once everything settles in a place like that, you don't need to ask questions anymore. You just wait for the pattern to complete itself. At some point, it stopped being about us. That shift wasn't emotional. It didn't come with a reaction or a moment of clarity. It came from the data itself, small details that didn't belong in something personal. One of the hotel charges stood out, not because of the amount or the date, but because of the location. I'd stayed there before. Not recently, but enough times to recognize it without checking. It was tied to a client account I managed, one of the larger ones. I went back through the statements again, filtered by city. There it was again. A restaurant a few blocks from a competitor's office. Not somewhere you end up by accident. Not somewhere you pick without knowing the area. I leaned back in the chair and let that sit for a minute. Up until then, everything could still be framed one way. Personal decisions. Private behavior. Something contained within the boundaries of a marriage. But locations don't exist in isolation. They connect. And once those connections started lining up with places tied to my work, the situation changed shape. I pulled up my work calendar. Cross-referenced dates. Not looking for confirmation anymore, just alignment. A client dinner I had 6 months ago. Same area. 2 days later, a charge appeared on that card from a hotel less than a mile away. Another instance. Different city. I'd been there for a site review. 2 weeks later, another charge. Same pattern. Close enough to notice. far enough apart to avoid overlap. That wasn't coincidence. That was awareness, which meant she knew where I was, when I was there, and when I wasn't. I didn't react to it, just kept tracing the lines. That's when the name showed up. Not from anything she said, not from a message or a contact list, from a receipt. Shortened, initial and last name. Enough to identify a reservation tied to one of the restaurant charges. I recognized it immediately. Mark. Same Mark who'd come up once in conversation months back. Someone from work. Nothing specific. Just a name that passed through without weight at the time. Now it had context. I didn't need more than that. I sat there, looking at the screen, not focusing on the individual charges anymore, but on the structure behind them. Because once a situation extends beyond something personal, it becomes something else entirely. It introduces variables that don't stay contained. Reputation, business relationships, overlap between personal access and professional space. Things that don't resolve themselves through conversation. I closed the account and set the phone down. Up until then, I had been observing a pattern. Now I understood the scope of it. And with that, the approach didn't change, but the stakes did. Because this wasn't just about what had happened. It was about where it had happened, and who had been involved. And that meant one thing. This would resolve itself without me needing to push it. I just had to let it continue long enough for everything to surface on its own. She was served on a Thursday, mid-morning, based on the timestamp I saw later. I didn't need to be there. That part was already set in motion days before. Filed, processed, scheduled, same way everything else had been handled. I was on site when my phone started vibrating. Once, then again, then a third time, back to back. I didn't check it right away. Finished the walkthrough with the crew, closed out a few notes, then stepped back into the truck and looked. 5 missed calls. All from her. No messages. That told me enough. If there had been confusion, there would have been a text. A question. Something controlled. Calls without context meant she didn't have a script yet. I set the phone down and drove home at the usual time. Nothing changed in my pace. When I walked in, she was already there. Sitting at the kitchen table, the papers spread out in front of her, hands resting flat against them like she was trying to hold them in place. She looked up when I came in. Not angry. Not calm either. Just unsettled. "What is this?" she asked. I set my keys down by the door, same place as always. Took off my boots. Washed my hands at the sink. Routine first. Then I sat across from her. "Everything you need is in front of you," I said. She stared at me, waiting for something more. An explanation. A reaction. Something she could work with. It didn't come. "This doesn't make any sense," she said. "Where is this coming from?" I didn't answer that. Instead, I watched her. Not her words, but the way she moved through them. Looking for footing. Trying different angles. "I don't understand why you would do this without talking to me first." There it was. The assumption that conversation would have changed anything. I leaned back slightly in the chair. "There's nothing to clarify," I said. Her expression tightened. "That's not true," she said quickly. "If there's something you think is going on." "I don't think," I said, cutting in, not raising my voice. "I know." That was the first moment she went still. Not defensive, not reactive, just paused. Because that removed the space she was trying to operate in. "What do you think you know?" she asked, quieter now. I didn't list anything. Didn't mention the card. The charges. The locations. The names. There was no need. "Enough," I said. Silence settled between us. She looked down at the papers again, then back up. "This is extreme," she said. "You're making a decision without even." "I already made the decision," I said. Flat. Final. She exhaled slowly, shifting in the chair. "This isn't how this works," she said. "You don't just end things like this. We need to talk about it." I nodded once. "We are talking." She shook her head, frustration starting to show. "No, you're not saying anything. You're just sitting there like this is already done." "It is." That landed. Not loudly, but completely. She studied my face then, like she was trying to find something she recognized. Something familiar she could use to pull the conversation back into control. It wasn't there. "Are you really not going to explain this?" she asked. I stood up from the table. "There's nothing left to explain," I said. And that was the end of it. Not because she stopped talking, but because there was nothing she could say that would change what had already been set in motion. After that, I didn't have to do anything. That was the part most people misunderstand. They think something like this requires pressure, confrontation, repetition. But once everything is documented and set in motion properly, it carries itself. The attorneys handled the structure. Requests went out. Financial records, communications, travel confirmations. Standard process. Nothing aggressive. Just complete. I reviewed everything once as it came in. Not looking for surprises. Just making sure it matched what I had already seen. It did. Dates aligned. Locations held. The same pattern repeated across multiple sources, statements, bookings, timestamps. Independent pieces forming the same timeline without needing interpretation. Her responses started to change as the process moved forward. At first, it was confusion. Then denial. Not direct, more like adjustments. Small shifts in how she described things. Language becoming less certain. Details becoming less specific. By the second round of filings, the story had moved again. Now it was partial acknowledgement. Framed differently. Context added where it hadn't existed before. But the structure didn't support it. Facts don't adapt to explanations. They stay where they are. Mark entered the process without needing to be introduced. His name appeared where it had to. Reservations. Shared locations. Overlapping records that placed him inside the same timeline without question. Once that happened, the situation extended beyond our case. His side began to move independently. Different attorney. Separate filings. But tied to the same set of facts. I didn't contact him. Didn't need to. The connection existed on paper. That was enough. From that point on, things progressed without input. Deadlines were met. Documents were submitted. Each step built on the previous one without deviation. There were attempts from her side to reposition things. Character statements. Reframing intent. Suggesting misunderstanding rather than structure. But none of it replaced what was already recorded. It just sat alongside it. And when placed side by side, the difference was clear. One was consistent. The other wasn't. I attended what was required. Signed where necessary. Spoke only when directly addressed. There wasn't anything to add. Because everything that mattered had already been established before the process even started. Outside of that, things began to shift around her. Work. Social circle. Small things at first. Then more visible changes. Schedules adjusting. People stepping back. Not dramatic. Just distance. The same kind of distance I had adjusted to months earlier. It doesn't happen all at once. It builds quietly. The same way everything else had. By the time it reached the final stages, there was nothing left to argue. No gaps. No missing pieces. Just a complete record of what had already taken place. And at that point, the outcome wasn't something anyone had to push for. It was already there, waiting to be finalized. The outcome wasn't complicated. By the time it reached final review, everything had already settled into place. There were no last-minute changes, no unexpected arguments, no attempts to reopen anything that had already been established. The records held. That was the only thing that mattered. Assets were divided based on documented contribution. Accounts were separated cleanly. No extensions. No adjustments made outside of what could be supported on paper. There was a brief attempt from her side to introduce additional claims. Future support. Reallocation based on circumstances. Language built around interpretation rather than evidence. It didn't go anywhere. Because there wasn't anything to attach it to. The same pattern that carried through everything else held here too. If it couldn't be verified, it didn't stay. In the end, the terms were simple. Each of us left with what could be traced directly back to us. No overlap. No negotiation beyond that. I didn't ask for more. Didn't need to. There's a point where adding anything extra doesn't improve the outcome. It just complicates something that's already resolved. This wasn't about gaining anything. It was about closing everything properly. The house was handled through standard procedure. Listed, reviewed, processed without delay. No disagreement there either. By that stage, neither of us had a reason to hold on to it. It had already stopped being what it was supposed to be. The final meeting was short. Documents reviewed one last time. Signatures placed where required. No discussion beyond confirming accuracy. She was there. Quiet. Composed in the same way she had been since the process stabilized. Not distant, just contained. We didn't speak. There wasn't anything left that required it. Once everything was signed, the room cleared quickly. Papers collected. Copies distributed. The structure that had been built over the previous weeks closed in a matter of minutes. I walked out the same way I had walked into every other step of it. No hesitation. No pause. Outside, the air felt the same as any other day. No shift. No sense of something ending. Because it hadn't ended in that room. It had ended much earlier. This was just the formal version of it. I got back into the truck, set the documents on the passenger seat, and sat there for a moment before starting the engine. Not thinking about what had happened. Just confirming that everything was complete. Nothing left open. Nothing left unresolved. And once that was clear, there was nothing else to do. So I started the truck and drove. No urgency. No direction beyond forward. Because at that point, that was all that remained. Sometimes I think about that number. $214. 17. Not often. It doesn't come up in any way that interrupts things. Just shows up occasionally. Usually when I'm reviewing something routine, an invoice, a statement, a line item that doesn't quite belong. It wasn't significant on its own. That's what made it easy to ignore at first. Small enough to pass through without attention. Clean. Justifiable if you didn't look too closely. But that's the thing about numbers. They don't carry meaning by themselves. They reflect whatever system they're part of. And that charge wasn't the cause of anything. It was the point where everything became visible. Nothing changed in that moment that hadn't already been in place. The pattern was already there. The structure already built. All that number did was expose it. I didn't go looking for anything after that. Didn't need to. Once something becomes clear at that level, there's no value in digging further. You don't get a different outcome by adding more detail to something that's already complete. It just confirms what you already know. So I let it stay what it was. A marker. Not the beginning. Not the end. Just the exact point where everything stopped being unclear. That's the end of this story. If you made it all the way here, consider subscribing to stay with us. I've placed a couple of recommended videos on screen for you. Pick one and keep watching. I'll see you in the next story.